Jungkook lay motionless inside the ICU as a secret that had been buried for far too long finally shattered the silence of the hospital. Behind the glass doors, Taehyung broke down in tears after discovering that Jimin had made a hidden promise to the doctors, a promise that quietly sacrificed his own future to save the person he loved most. As RM, Jin, Suga, and J-Hope slowly realized they had only seen a small piece of the truth, an even more devastating reality began to surface. But the moment Jungkook finally opened his eyes and revealed something that even the doctors were never prepared to hear, the entire hospital was thrown into chaos. What was the secret promise Jimin had hidden all this time, and why would its truth change all of their lives forever? Only a few days earlier, everything had seemed almost ordinary. Jimin and Jungkook were known among their closest friends as two people whose bond had been built on unwavering trust, quiet loyalty, and countless moments of silent understanding. They rarely needed words to recognize each other's struggles, and that invisible connection often amazed RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, and Taehyung. Whether they were sharing exhausting schedules or brief moments of peace, there was always an unspoken promise that neither of them would ever let the other face hardship alone. From the outside, it looked like a friendship strong enough to survive anything, yet beneath those reassuring smiles, a hidden burden had already begun growing heavier with each passing day. Jimin carried an anxiety he refused to reveal, convincing himself that protecting Jungkook meant hiding the painful truth no matter the cost. Every hospital visit that he secretly made became another piece of a puzzle no one else could see. The doctors watched him arrive alone, always asking the same question with determined eyes, never allowing anyone to contact Jungkook. Even when the medical reports became increasingly alarming, Jimin remained calm on the surface, carefully burying every fear behind a gentle smile that fooled almost everyone around him. Meanwhile, Jungkook sensed that something had changed. Small details began to stand out: the exhaustion hidden behind Jimin's eyes, the delayed replies to late-night messages, the forced laughter during gatherings, and the mysterious disappearances that always ended with vague explanations. None of it made sense, but every unanswered question quietly planted another seed of doubt inside his heart. Taehyung noticed the growing distance as well. He often caught Jimin staring silently through hospital windows before quickly pretending everything was fine whenever someone approached. At first, Taehyung believed Jimin was simply overwhelmed by stress, but the sadness lingering in his expression never truly disappeared. RM tried to keep everyone together, encouraging patience instead of suspicion, while Jin constantly prepared meals in hopes of lifting everyone's spirits. Suga observed everything without saying much, trusting that silence often revealed more than words ever could, and J-Hope desperately searched for reasons to keep hope alive whenever the atmosphere became unbearably heavy. Despite everyone's efforts, an invisible wall continued rising between Jimin and Jungkook. Neither of them wanted to hurt the other, yet every attempt to protect one another only deepened the misunderstanding. Then came the day everything changed. A sudden emergency sent Jungkook to the very hospital Jimin had been visiting in secret. The familiar hallways, the anxious doctors, and the unmistakable expressions on the medical staff's faces immediately made Jimin realize that the truth he had struggled so hard to hide was now dangerously close to being exposed. As the ICU doors closed behind Jungkook, Jimin's composure finally began to crack, unaware that Taehyung was only moments away from discovering a confidential document that would reveal a promise powerful enough to change every relationship forever. The endless beeping of the ICU monitors echoed through the silent corridor like a relentless countdown, each sound tightening the fear gripping everyone outside the room. Hours passed with almost no updates, leaving RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, and Taehyung trapped between hope and despair. Jimin remained seated near the window without moving, his hands tightly clasped together as though he were holding onto the last fragile thread keeping his emotions from falling apart. Every nurse who walked past seemed to recognize him, exchanging quiet glances that only deepened the mystery surrounding his repeated visits to the hospital long before Jungkook had ever been admitted. Taehyung noticed those reactions immediately. The nurses greeted Jimin with familiar sympathy rather than surprise, and one elderly doctor briefly placed a reassuring hand on Jimin's shoulder before disappearing behind a restricted door. It was a small gesture, but it carried the weight of a history no one else knew. Questions that had lingered in Taehyung's mind for weeks suddenly became impossible to ignore. Why did the hospital staff know Jimin so well? Why had Jimin hidden everything from the people who cared about him most? As the tension grew heavier, RM quietly attempted to keep everyone calm, reminding them that panic would not change the outcome waiting beyond the ICU doors. Jin silently distributed cups of coffee that soon turned cold in everyone's hands, untouched as anxiety consumed every thought. J-Hope tried to offer comforting smiles, but even his optimism faded beneath the overwhelming uncertainty. Suga watched Jimin with careful eyes, sensing that the greatest battle taking place was not inside the ICU but inside Jimin himself. Every passing minute seemed to drain another piece of his strength. Eventually, a nurse accidentally dropped a thin medical folder near the waiting area before rushing away to answer an emergency call. Taehyung instinctively picked it up, intending only to return it, but a single page slipped free and landed at his feet. His eyes froze on the familiar name printed across the document. It was Jimin's. Beneath it were several official medical forms, consent papers, and one handwritten declaration carrying Jimin's unmistakable signature. The document described a confidential agreement between Jimin and the hospital specialists, an agreement requesting that every available treatment, specialist, and emergency resource be prioritized for Jungkook if both of them ever required critical care at the same time. Even more heartbreaking was the final paragraph, where Jimin had voluntarily refused to be informed of certain results concerning his own condition until Jungkook had fully recovered. Taehyung felt his entire body go numb. The realization struck him with unbearable force. While everyone believed Jimin had been acting distant out of coldness or secrecy, he had actually been preparing to sacrifice every chance he had for himself without expecting gratitude or recognition. Tears blurred Taehyung's vision as he looked toward Jimin, who remained unaware that his deepest secret had just been uncovered. Before Taehyung could gather the courage to confront him, alarms suddenly erupted from inside the ICU. Doctors and nurses rushed through the hallway with terrifying urgency, and the red emergency lights began flashing above the entrance. The waiting room fell into complete silence as every heartbeat seemed to stop at once. No one knew whether the emergency involved Jungkook, Jimin's hidden condition, or something even more devastating that had been waiting to reveal itself all along. The emergency alarms continued to echo through the intensive care unit, turning every second into an unbearable test of endurance. Doctors rushed past without slowing down, their expressions revealing a level of urgency that no reassuring words could hide. Behind the sealed ICU doors, shadows moved rapidly beneath the harsh white lights, while the rhythmic sound of medical equipment rose and fell in unpredictable patterns. Outside, the waiting area had become painfully silent. No one dared to imagine the worst, yet everyone felt it creeping closer with every passing moment. Jimin remained standing only a few steps from the entrance, his face drained of color as though he already knew something the others did not. Taehyung clutched the confidential document against his chest, unable to erase the devastating truth he had just discovered. Every sentence on those pages now carried a completely different meaning. Jimin had never been trying to push Jungkook away. He had been trying to protect him from a burden he believed Jungkook should never have to carry. The weight of that realization broke something inside Taehyung, replacing weeks of frustration with overwhelming guilt. RM slowly noticed the tears forming in Taehyung's eyes and understood that whatever he had found was far more serious than anyone had imagined. Jin's hands trembled as he watched Taehyung silently fold the papers, while Suga's quiet expression sharpened with concern. J-Hope looked from one face to another, realizing that fear was no longer centered only on Jungkook's condition. Another invisible crisis had been unfolding all along, hidden behind Jimin's unwavering smile. Then the ICU doors finally opened. Instead of relief, a senior physician stepped into the hallway with an expression so heavy that every hopeful thought immediately disappeared. His eyes settled on Jimin first before slowly moving toward the rest of the group. Without saying much, he handed Jimin a sealed envelope that had been prepared days earlier under strict instructions. The doctor explained only one thing through exhausted eyes. Jungkook had insisted that if anything unexpected happened during his treatment, this envelope had to be given to Jimin immediately. Confusion spread across everyone's faces. No one understood how Jungkook could have prepared something in advance when he had arrived at the hospital in critical condition only hours before. With shaking hands, Jimin stared at the envelope, recognizing Jungkook's handwriting on the front. His breathing became uneven as memories flooded back. Small moments that had once seemed ordinary now carried frightening significance. Suddenly, Jimin realized that perhaps he had not been the only one hiding a life-changing secret. As the envelope slowly opened, a single folded page slipped into his hands, and the first sentence instantly caused the color to vanish from his face. At that exact moment, Taehyung understood that the promise Jimin had made to the doctors was only half of the story, because Jungkook had been protecting a secret of his own the entire time, one that threatened to change everything they believed about sacrifice, loyalty, and the meaning of loving someone enough to let them go. Jimin stared at the handwritten page as if the words themselves had frozen time. His fingers trembled so violently that he could barely keep hold of the letter, while the silence surrounding him became heavier than the chaos inside the ICU. RM instinctively stepped closer, Jin held his breath, Suga lowered his gaze, J-Hope clasped his hands together, and Taehyung watched every change in Jimin's expression with growing dread. Whatever Jungkook had written was powerful enough to drain every trace of strength from the person who had spent months pretending to be the strongest among them. The first lines revealed something almost impossible to believe. Jungkook had known about Jimin's secret hospital visits long before anyone else. He had quietly followed the trail of unanswered messages, disappearing afternoons, and exhausted smiles until he eventually discovered the truth hidden within confidential medical records. Yet instead of confronting Jimin, Jungkook chose silence. He believed that exposing the truth would only force Jimin to abandon the promise he had made to the doctors. From that moment forward, Jungkook began carrying his own unbearable secret. He acted as though nothing had changed, smiled through gatherings, laughed during ordinary moments, and continued standing beside Jimin, all while secretly knowing that Jimin had been preparing to sacrifice everything for him. Every memory suddenly transformed into something painfully different. The quiet dinners, the late-night walks, the brief smiles that seemed slightly forced, and the countless moments when Jungkook simply looked at Jimin without saying a word now carried an entirely new meaning. He had not been confused by Jimin's distance. He had understood it. And rather than stopping him, he had decided to protect Jimin's dignity by pretending to know nothing at all. The greatest misunderstanding had never been built on lies. It had been built on two people trying to shield each other from the same devastating truth. Tears rolled down Taehyung's face as that realization settled into everyone's heart. For weeks he had quietly blamed Jimin for shutting everyone out. He had believed the silence was selfish. Now he saw that every painful decision Jimin made had come from love, and every quiet smile Jungkook returned had come from the exact same place. Neither of them had wanted to become a burden. Neither of them had wanted the other to suffer. In trying to protect one another, they had both accepted loneliness as the price. Then Jimin reached the final page of the letter. His breathing stopped for a brief moment before he slowly lowered the paper. Jungkook had written that if he ever regained consciousness, there was one final truth that no one, not even Jimin, could continue hiding. Months earlier, during one of Jimin's secret consultations, Jungkook had privately met with the same medical team and signed a confidential document of his own. It was a legal request declaring that if circumstances ever forced the doctors to choose between saving his life or preserving Jimin's future, every possible effort must be directed toward Jimin instead. The room fell completely silent. Even the doctors standing nearby looked away, unable to hide their emotions. Two separate promises, made in complete secrecy, had placed each other's lives above their own. Neither Jimin nor Jungkook had known the other had made the exact same sacrifice. As tears streamed down Jimin's face, a nurse suddenly rushed out of the ICU with urgent news. Jungkook's condition had changed again, but this time, not in the way anyone expected. His eyes had opened, and the very first thing he did was search the room as though he already knew the truth could no longer remain hidden. Behind the glass, their eyes finally met, and in that silent moment, every sacrifice, every misunderstanding, and every hidden promise became impossible to keep buried any longer. Jimin could barely remain standing as he looked through the ICU glass and saw Jungkook's eyes open for the first time. There was no anger in that exhausted gaze, no accusation, and no trace of resentment. Instead, there was a quiet understanding that reached far beyond words, as though both of them had finally realized they had spent months carrying the exact same burden alone. Around them, the entire hallway had fallen into complete silence. RM lowered his head, Jin wiped away tears he could no longer hide, Suga closed his eyes in quiet reflection, J-Hope covered his face as emotion overwhelmed him, and Taehyung stood frozen, still clutching the documents that had changed everything. What they had believed was a story of distance and broken trust had turned out to be something entirely different, a story of two people whose love for one another had become so selfless that it pushed them into painful isolation. The attending physician slowly approached the group with a calmer expression than before. The emergency inside the ICU had finally stabilized. Jungkook's condition remained critical, but the immediate danger had passed. Then the doctor revealed the truth that no one outside the medical team had fully understood. Months earlier, Jimin had not been visiting the hospital because he was abandoning Jungkook or hiding an unforgivable mistake. He had been undergoing extensive compatibility tests, consultations, and evaluations after learning that a rare treatment might someday be needed to save Jungkook's life. The confidential promise he signed was not merely symbolic. It authorized the hospital to use every possible medical option available to protect Jungkook, even if doing so meant placing Jimin's own future at significant risk. Before anyone could fully process those words, the doctor gently unfolded another confidential file. This time it belonged to Jungkook. Without Jimin ever knowing, Jungkook had repeatedly returned to the same hospital after discovering what Jimin was planning. He quietly asked the specialists to reject any procedure that would permanently endanger Jimin, even if it reduced his own chances of recovery. Neither request had ever been disclosed because medical confidentiality required absolute silence. The result was heartbreaking. Two people had spent months asking doctors to save the other instead of themselves, each believing the other would never discover the truth. Taehyung finally understood why every hospital employee had looked at Jimin with such sympathy. They had witnessed a sacrifice that could never be spoken aloud. They had also watched Jungkook make the exact same impossible choice. There had never been a villain in this story. Only fear, silence, and two hearts determined to protect each other at any cost. With permission from the medical team, Jimin quietly entered the ICU. The machines continued their steady rhythm as he approached Jungkook's bedside. Jungkook looked physically exhausted, yet the tension that had shadowed his eyes for months had finally disappeared. No explanation was necessary anymore. Every hidden appointment, every sleepless night, every forced smile, every misunderstanding, and every silent goodbye had already been answered by the truth resting between them. Outside the room, Taehyung slowly sank into a chair, tears flowing freely as relief replaced weeks of guilt. RM rested a comforting hand on his shoulder, while Jin, Suga, and J-Hope exchanged emotional glances that reflected the same lesson. They realized how easily silence could be mistaken for betrayal and how often love hid itself behind actions that seemed impossible to understand. Over the following weeks, recovery came slowly. Jungkook regained his strength one careful step at a time, while Jimin no longer carried his burden alone. The secret promises that had once driven them apart instead became the foundation for rebuilding trust, not because sacrifice had solved everything, but because the truth had finally been allowed into the light. The hospital that had once echoed with fear gradually became a place associated with hope, second chances, and the courage to be honest with the people who mattered most. Taehyung often returned to the quiet hallway outside the ICU, remembering the day he believed everything had been lost. He no longer saw it as the place where despair reached its peak. Instead, it became the place where hidden love was finally revealed. Sometimes the deepest devotion is invisible until the very moment it is almost too late. And perhaps the greatest act of loyalty is not sacrificing yourself in silence, but trusting someone enough to let them carry your pain with you. If this story moved you, let it serve as a reminder that the people we love cannot protect us from burdens they never know we carry. Sometimes the truth we fear sharing is the very thing that has the power to save us all. The morning sunlight slowly filtered through the hospital windows, replacing the cold glow of emergency lights that had dominated the building for so many sleepless nights. The corridors that had once echoed with hurried footsteps and desperate prayers now felt almost peaceful. Nurses greeted one another with quiet smiles, doctors continued their rounds with steady confidence, and the atmosphere that had once been filled with fear gradually transformed into one of cautious hope. Yet for RM, Jin, Suga, J-Hope, Taehyung, Jimin, and Jungkook, the hospital would never again be just another building. It had become the place where silence had nearly destroyed everything and where the truth had finally brought them back together. Recovery was far from easy. Jungkook still faced weeks of rehabilitation, countless medical examinations, and moments when even standing required more strength than he believed he had left. Jimin rarely left his side, but this time there were no hidden appointments, no secret conversations with doctors, and no lonely walks through unfamiliar hallways. Every treatment plan, every difficult decision, and every medical update was shared openly. The fear that had once isolated them slowly gave way to something stronger than sacrifice alone: trust. Taehyung often found himself returning to the ICU waiting area, not because he wanted to relive the painful memories, but because he wanted to remember how easily people could misunderstand the ones they loved most. Every empty chair reminded him of the nights he had quietly judged Jimin without knowing the truth. Every silent hallway reminded him that pain often wears the same face as distance. The tears he had shed outside those ICU doors had changed him forever. He promised himself that he would never again mistake silence for indifference without first searching for the story hidden beneath it. RM watched the group slowly rebuild what had nearly been lost. He realized that leadership was not always about finding answers. Sometimes it meant staying beside people while they searched for their own. Jin continued bringing homemade meals to every hospital visit, filling the room with warmth that no medicine could provide. Suga quietly documented small victories that no one else noticed: the first genuine smile, the first peaceful night of sleep, the first laugh that sounded real again. J-Hope filled every difficult day with encouragement, proving that hope often survives even in places built around suffering. As the weeks turned into months, Jungkook regained more than physical strength. He regained the confidence to believe that he no longer had to protect the people he loved by carrying every burden alone. Jimin underwent his own healing as well. The guilt that had haunted him for so long slowly disappeared, replaced by the comforting realization that allowing others to stand beside him was never a sign of weakness. The greatest promise either of them could make was no longer one written on confidential hospital documents. It was the promise to never let silence speak louder than honesty again. Long after they finally walked out of the hospital together, the memory of those frightening days continued to shape every decision they made. The experience reminded all of them that genuine love is not measured by how much pain someone hides, but by the courage to trust another person enough to share it. Sometimes the strongest hearts are not the ones willing to sacrifice everything in secret, they are the ones brave enough to admit they cannot face the storm alone. And although the hidden promises that nearly tore them apart would remain unforgettable, the promise they carried into the future became even more powerful: No matter how frightening the truth might be, they would face it together, never allowing fear, misunderstanding, or silence to separate them again. This story is entirely fictional and created for entertainment purposes. It does not depict real events or the real lives, actions, or relationships of Jimin, Jungkook, Taehyung, BTS, or any real individuals. Any resemblance to actual events is purely coincidental.